Good morning. You're watching All You Need to Know on Bloomberg Quint Live, and I'm Alex Matthew. First, the headlines. Asian markets are off to a muted start in today's session. Shares on Wall Street ended mixed while oil prices fell. Finance Ministry and RBI officials are set to meet today to decide on the borrowing calendar for the second half of the current financial year. Power Finance Corporation and Bank of Baroda have called off their rupee-denominated debt sales as fears of additional government borrowing has led to a rise in the costs of borrowing. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a pledge to more than double India's non-fossil fuel power generation target to 450 gigawatts at the Global Climate Summit. Let's talk about US markets now. Stocks on Wall Street ended little changed after Friday's losses on fears that trade talks had hit another roadblock. In fact, the three benchmark indices ended almost completely unchanged. Renita Young of Bloomberg News sums up the day's trade in this report.
U.S. markets fluctuated during much of Monday's session, ending mixed and barely changed from Friday's session, all after mixed global economic data stokes concerns of slowing global growth and sends investors into safe havens. Now, although IHS market data signaled that the U.S. economy remains the front runner, we did see weaker than expected Eurozone data when it relates to manufacturing and a gauge of employment and services industries, pointing to job losses for the first time in about a decade. Now, there's no surprise that because of all that, investors ran to treasuries, the U.S. dollar, and gold, which all saw rises during the session. Meanwhile, we had quite a bit of companies news, with Overstock.com falling more than 15% during the session after its third quarter EBITDA outlook was cut and it announced its CFO departure. Walmart's decision to, on Friday, stop offering electronic cigarettes in the United States stores weighed heavily on tobacco stocks on Monday. And earnings are coming up a little bit later. We'll have Carnival Corp, but tomorrow on Tuesday, we'll also have AutoZone, CarMax, and Nike. And that's a look at your Monday Wall Street action. In New York, I'm Renita Young for Bloomberg News.
All right, let's also take a look at the Asian markets. I'm joined live by Rosalind Chin, who's joining us from the Bloomberg studios in Hong Kong. Good morning, Rosalind. Not much direction coming in from the US markets. How's Asia looking this morning?
You're right, it has been fairly muted here in Asia without a lot of strong direction from the US. But we have got Japan coming back online today after a public holiday on Monday. So right now, the Nikkei is making gains of about 0.25%, getting back some of its earlier gains, in fact. And the Topix up by 0.67%. The MSCI Asia Pacific overall up by just over 0.1% right now. The traders, markets in the region do seem to be focused on two main things today. So the first is, of course, developments in the US-China trade war. That, of course, always hanging over proceedings here. And the second, of course, is any hint of any further easing or signs of any further easing from any of the central banks. We've had, of course, the Fed, the New York Fed, the St. Louis Fed president, I get my words out, James Bullard, saying that more easing may be needed to offset downside risks from trade conflicts and too low inflation. We've also got some central banks here in Asia about to make their decisions this week, including New Zealand, Philippines, and also Thailand. So that's coming this week. Now, on the trade front, of course, we've heard Shinzo Abe and Donald Trump are due to meet this week, in fact, tomorrow on Wednesday, to talk about trade. According to the Daily Yomiuri, their agreement there will not yet be ready to be signed, but they will sign another document confirming that they have a trade deal. But according to the Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga, no agreement yet has been fully made on a trade deal, but he did say there is to be no extra auto tariff. The Chief Cabinet Secretary also said they're accelerating the remaining US-Japan trade negotiations. So we'll see on Wednesday, tomorrow, what exactly the two leaders will be signing. Shares of Japanese paint manufacturers climbed. That's after Jefferies increased their price targets. So companies like Kansai Paint, Nippon Paint gaining there. Elsewhere in the region, the Chinese markets opened higher today. Shanghai Composite up by about a fifth of 1% right now. Hang Seng up by just over a tenth of 1%. And in Australia, the S&P ASX 200 is just about flat, just about staying in positive territory right now. Main movers there really are some of the the gold-related companies and also mining companies. And quick look at Korea, the Kospi actually dipping into negative territory, down by 0.0% at this point in time, 0.06% at this point in time. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Rosalind. Now, over the last week, the US Federal Reserve has had to work unusually hard to control a key policy rate after overnight repo lending dried up. Former New York Fed President William Dudley spoke exclusively to Bloomberg earlier in the day, and here's what he said on the issue.
The Fed has shrunk its balance sheet over time. Currency is growing. The Treasury's cash balance at the Fed is growing now that the debt limit issue is being resolved. And so as a consequence, the number of reserves in the banking system has been shrinking. And this is tricky because the Federal Reserve doesn't really know how much bank reserves banks need to satisfy the new liquidity coverage ratio requirements. These are liquidity requirements. And how much demand is going to be generated by the fact that interest is now paid on reserves. So the Fed, for years there was plenty of reserves in the system, right. But now they're getting to the point where reserves demand is equaling reserve supply, and so if there's a little bit of a shock to the system, that can put upward pressure.
But you just said the heart of the matter. This is the trust market of short-term paper. You worked for years in the trenches of this with your Goldman Sachs market experience over to the New York Fed with Geithner, and you just said it. The Fed doesn't really know. That the Fed doesn't really know, does that potentially affect trust in this important
No, I don't
market?
think so. I mean, I think we always knew that there was some desired demand for reserves, but we couldn't observe how much that demand was because there was more than sufficient reserves in the system. So there was always going to be a point where the reserve supply shrank to the point that we would see upward pressure on short-term rates. And when we reached that point, the Fed would know, what do they need to do? They need to add more reserves to the system, and that's what we saw over the past week.
One complaint we have had is that they were late. They weren't quick enough. What's your response to that?
Well, in the scheme of things, maybe one day would be nice if they had responded maybe a little bit more quickly. But in the scheme of things, this is an event for markets. It's not an event for the economy at all.
But you know what the narrative is that's emerging over the last couple of weeks? In fact, it's been emerging for the last 12 months, Bill, is that you left, Simon Potter reportedly was squeezed out, and this New York Fed is different under Williams than it was to you. That this New York Fed isn't as sensitive as what's happening with markets as it was under you.
I don't accept that.
Well, defend John Williams and the Fed, please.
Well, we knew that there was going to be some point where reserves had shrunk to the point where demand for reserves was going to equal supply, and when that happened, we're going to see some upward pressure on rates. That's what happened that last week. No surprise there. The other thing that people I think don't really appreciate, it's not one person at the top of the Federal Reserve that does its thing. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of really qualified people that execute monetary policy on behalf of the Federal Reserve. And where are we today? We're in a good place. Repo rates are now back down to where they should be. The federal funds rate is well within its range. So mission accomplished.
All right, let's also take a look at what's making headlines across the globe. Sue Keenan of Bloomberg News brings you the first word headlines.
We start with Budweiser Brewing. It is said to be pricing its revived Hong Kong IPO at the bottom of the range at $27 HK a share. Now, last week, AB InBev, I should say, said it was aiming to raise up to $4.8 billion in the sale. It had been hoping to raise double that before shelving the offering in July. Now, the revived IPO has attracted cornerstone investment from Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, GIC. On to President Trump now. He has asked Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin to explain why the U.S. requested China cancel a planned tour of Midwest farms. The visits in Montana and Nebraska were abruptly called off on Friday, causing markets to tumble amid fear the trade talks had stumbled. Mnuchin says the timing didn't work, and so the tour was halted. President Trump asked why, indicating he was not happy with the decision.
So we didn't want there to be any confusion. They have started buying agriculture. They're going to reschedule that at a different time. The timing didn't work, but that was purely our request.
Why was that our request, just out of curiosity?
We didn't want confusion around the trade.
Yeah, but I want them to buy farm products.
There was no confusion. We want them to buy agriculture. They committed to buy agriculture, and they're doing it.
They've committed to buy a lot of agriculture, and they're going to start, and they've started. And we should get them over there as soon as possible.
Staying with President Trump, he has made a short and unexpected appearance at the UN Climate Change Summit in New York, listening to the debate but declining to speak. World leaders and business figures are scheduled to discuss how to tackle climate change, this amid growing popular anger at the lack of action so far. Teenage activist Greta Thunberg told the summit that they've ignored the issue for too long.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Sue Keenan. This is Bloomberg.
All right, Agam Vakil is here to tell you all about the day's trade and what's happening in the futures and options space. Agam, it seems like we are in India moving on a different track in terms of markets as compared to everybody else. You have the US markets that ended completely flat. You have mixed cues coming in from Asia as we speak. But again, we're talking about a positive uptick.
Yeah, I reckon, Alex, that a lot of analysts are still trying to factor in the advantages and the benefits that the corporate tax rates will come through for corporate India. And that's the reason why we're continuing to see that gain as far as the world Indian markets are concerned. And for now, we're likely to open with a little more gains as far as the SGX Nifty goes. We must also remember that, and I made this point yesterday as well, there will be a lot of systems traders where their buy calls will have activated, which is why we're looking at more buying as far as the indices are concerned. So this is partly to do with a technical aspect as well. Let's move on and talk about how markets fanned out yesterday. More strength coming in, 3% up move for the benchmark indices, mid-cap and small-cap indices following through. Most stocks out there did advance, and there was more strength in the banking index. But what about American depository receipts? How about stocks listed abroad? Well, so we did see more gains in ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank, but this is largely a catch-up trade. Tata Motors, on the other hand, was down around 3.5%. So, and of course, we did see more weakness in stocks where we saw declines come through. So the pharma and the IT sector was down, and that is exactly how it played out as far as ADRs are concerned. But for perhaps the first time, and not on account of a bulk deal, there was fund inflow from FIIs, and this time it was to the tune of 2,700 crores rupees on a net basis. And again, this was not on account of one or two bulk deals. So this certainly is a turn as far as the trend is concerned. Of course, DIs continue by to the tune of 292 crores. Now, in terms of contributors, again, it was largely broad-based. As you can see, about 235 points were contributed by the broader markets, but we did have the HDFC Twins also, along with our L&T and ICICI Bank also will push the indices higher. What about futures and options? Are we looking at more longs? Well, it is expiry week, and just so happens that the strength is coming in expiry week. So rollover standing at around 27%. Average rollover so far. The Nifty Bank rollover is also standing at around 28%. These rollovers have caught up, because as of yesterday, the Bank Nifty rollovers were lagging to a certain extent. Let's see our 26th September open interest distribution, and for now it seems like we are likely to see a lot of support around the 11,500 mark, which means that markets are unlikely to close below that, at least before the expiry. We never know, but these things could change, but it's unlikely that 11,400 could be taken out. Even if it would be, it would take a lot of will. And of course, as you can see, 11,400, 11,500 puts are the most active, have seen the most amount of accumulation yesterday. So moving on, the VIX, of course, rose 9%. Now, one may ask, why is the VIX rising if the markets are also advancing when it usually isn't the case? We must remember there's an expansion in option premiums, and the VIX is largely moves on the back of expansion option premiums, because of the fact that we've seen expansion in calls as well as the reason. In terms terms of stocks which are seeing unwinding, well, that list will be a tad longer with Torrent Power, Grasim and Bajaj Auto in that list. All in all, Alex, while we are expecting some strength, there could also be, some expectation of some profit taking, considering the kind of sharp up move that we've seen in the markets over the past.
But that FII inflow is also a headline that you're taking away from it. Thanks so much for that, Agam. All right, Finance Ministry and RBI officials are scheduled to meet today to take a call on the borrowing calendar for the second half of the fiscal. The meet comes after the government announced just on Friday measures to spur the economy, including corporate tax rate cuts, which is estimated to cost the government as much as 1.45 lakh crore rupees. Rishti Benewal has the details.
India will stick to its budgeted borrowing target for the year, even after giving a $20 billion tax stimulus to the corporate sector. Our sources are telling us there is a meeting between Finance Ministry officials and RBI officials in New Delhi to finalize the second half borrowing calendar, and the plan is to stick to the target for the year. This meeting is very important because, at the end of the meeting, we will also get to know whether the government is going ahead with its budget announcement to go for India's first overseas sovereign bond plan. So we will be closely tracking that meeting to know what is the plan on India's first overseas sovereign bond.
To look at the stocks that you have to watch out for in trade today, I have with me Somit Sarkar, who's joining me to tell you all about the stocks in news. Good morning, Somit. What's on your list today?
Good morning, Alex. I'll start off with Hexaware. Now, they had their analyst meet yesterday, and in that analyst meet, the company emphasized that the banking and financial service segment will be the key focus area for securing growth. Along with that, the company also said that they will look to sustain superior performance in IMS, BPS and the healthcare segment. Now, the company is aiming for 17 to 18% revenue growth over the next 5 years, and the management reiterated that a potential merger with NIT Tech is unlikely. Now, Petronet also held a conference call yesterday to give some clarity on the Tellurian deal, and in the conference call, the management said that the LNG offtake could be in the range of around 1 to 5 MTPA and not necessarily 5 MTPA. Now, also, the Petronet is an equity investor in Tellurian, which means that the company would get LNG at a cost plus minimal margins, and the company also said that they would walk away from the deal if there are no customers to buy the LNG that they are importing from US. Now, there won't be any pricing risk for this contracts, and everything will be passed on to the customers. That is also what the management clarified. And lastly, the management also said that even affiliate companies might participate in the $2.5 billion equity investment that Petronet has committed to Tellurian. CG Power and Industrial Solution will also remain in focus because ROC has granted 2.5-month extension from September 30th onwards for holding the annual general meet of the company. Also, Aurobindo Pharma would remain in focus because SEBI has imposed a 22 crore fine on the promoters of the company and other connected entities for violating insider trading norms. Thomas Cook, because the company clarified that it has not received any intimation from MCA and has no existing relationship with Arush Forex on the news of suspicious transactions made by the company. Lastly, a couple of stocks that would remain in focus because of bulk deals. Z Entertainment, firstly, Catalyst Trusteeship sold nearly 72.5 lakh shares, that is 0.8% stake, while in Apollo Pipes, Ashish Kacholia acquired 2.3 lakh shares, that is around 1.8% stake in the company, while the seller of this was Canara HSBC Oriental Bank of Commerce, which sold nearly 1.4 lakh shares at 375 rupees each.
Thanks so much for that, Somit. Now, world leaders and diplomats gathered at the United Nations General Assembly meet in New York with plenty of geopolitical intrigue at play. But the fight against climate change took center stage. 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg delivered an emotional speech at the UN Climate Summit yesterday, holding members present accountable for their actions. Take a look.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
Strong words there, but let's also take a look at some of the climate change solutions that world leaders pitched at the United Nations General Assembly.
Deshalb haben wir uns vorgenommen, bis 2030 55% unserer CO2-Emissionen gegenüber 1990 einzusparen und im Jahre 2050 klimaneutral zu sein. Dazu wollen wir 2030 65%, das heißt 2/3 unserer Energieversorgung, aus erneuerbaren Energien erwirtschaften. Wir werden 2022 aus der Kernenergie aussteigen und spätestens 2038 aus der Kohlekraftwerkswirtschaft.
We've established a $100 million green investment fund to help shift private investment towards the zero carbon economy of the future. And we've created a $300 million fund aimed at supporting climate mitigation and adaptation in the Pacific. And we've done all of that in just 2 years.
Nous devons collectivement, chefs d'État et de gouvernement, changer la rapidité de nos réponses, rester dans l'accord de Paris et être pleinement en conformité avec ses objectifs. Premièrement, moi je me félicite aujourd'hui qu'on ait eu la bonne nouvelle de la ratification de l'accord de Paris par la Russie. Formidable nouvelle.
We have already submitted a second and more ambitious nationally determined contribution, as well as a decarbonization strategy to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
Let's take a look at some of the stories you'll find on the website bloombergquint.com if you were to have a look as of now. Germany's economy is suffering the worst downturn in almost 7 years as a manufacturing slump deepens, raising pressure on the government to add fiscal stimulus. Factory activities shrank at the fastest pace in a decade in September, and growth in services softened, according to a monthly report by IHS Markit. There were also further signs that the labor market is taking a hit. That could have an adverse impact on demand and set off a negative spiral for Europe's biggest economy. And back home, cement prices fell for the 4th straight month in September as a labor shortage ahead of the festive season weighed on construction activity. All India average cement prices marginally dipped by 2 rupees month on month, that is sequentially, to 338 rupees for a 50-kilogram bag in September, according to the survey of 15 dealers across 5 regions. The price cut on a pan-India basis was cushioned by a big price hike in southern India. That's all you need to know going into trade today. Do stay tuned though, there's a lot more coming up in just a short while. This is Bloomberg Quint.